It began on a Sunday, the kind of cold, heavy morning where the air clung to your breath and every sound seemed to travel a little too far in the stillness. San Martino was a small, walled village high in the hills of northern Italy, a place where the church bells marked time more reliably than any clock. But on November 18th, 2001, those bells never rang. It was just after dawn when the first villagers noticed something was wrong. The monastery, an ancient stone building that had stood for centuries at the eastern edge of the village, looked lifeless. No smoke curling from the kitchen chimney, no morning hymn echoing from the chapel. The place that had always been awake before anyone else was now completely still. By mid-morning, the absence had grown impossible to ignore. A few villagers crossed the frosted courtyard to check on the nuns. The monastery's heavy oak doors were shut tight, the brass handle icy to the touch. When they tried the latch, it gave no movement, locked from within. That was strange. In living memory, the front doors had never been bolted in the daytime. One man knocked, his hand echoing against the old wood. No reply. Another shouted for Sister Agnes, the eldest of the 4 women who lived there. The only answer was the wind hissing between the cloister arches. When they finally managed to gain entry through a side passage, a small service door left unlatched, they found themselves in a corridor where the smell of cold stone and incense hung in the air. The silence was suffocating. One by one, they checked the rooms. Each was neat and orderly. Beds made with tight hospital corners, prayer books left open on nightstands as if waiting for the women to return. Coats hung neatly on pegs, personal belongings, crucifixes, letters from family, half-finished knitting, remained exactly where they should have been. There were no signs of a struggle. In Sister Maria's cell, the youngest and newest to the order, her slippers were beside the bed and her winter coat folded on a chair. It looked as if she'd simply stepped out for a moment and never come back. In the kitchen, a loaf of bread sat uncut on the counter, and a small pot of broth cooled on the stove untouched. The only thing out of place was the faint scent of burnt candle wax, as if many had been lit for hours the night before. By late morning, the parish priest had contacted the local carabinieri. 2 officers arrived from the nearest town, their boots leaving wet prints on the flagstone floors as they walked through the monastery, calling the nuns' names. They checked the chapel first. It was immaculate, rows of polished pews, sunlight falling across the altar. But one detail caught their attention. On the altar itself, a single candle burnt low, its wax spilling onto the cloth. Villagers later confirmed they had seen candlelight in the chapel windows deep into the night before, long after Compline prayers should have ended. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. The main door was locked from the inside. The windows were latched. Even the rear gate to the small orchard was bolted shut. The only footprints in the frost outside belonged to the villagers who had come that morning. The officers began to suspect that if the nuns had left, they had done so willingly, but that didn't explain why they left everything behind, or how they left without using a door. Word of the disappearance spread quickly. By afternoon, nearly the entire village had gathered in the courtyard, their voices hushed. Some whispered that perhaps the 4 women had gone on an unannounced retreat, though no one could recall that ever happening before. Others muttered about the old stories, that the monastery was built on older foundations, and that there were places beneath it no one went anymore. Still others remembered the strange chanting they had heard drifting from the chapel in recent weeks, chants that didn't match the usual hymns. The police remained for hours, making a preliminary search of the building and grounds. They found no discarded habits, no signs of packed bags, and no personal notes. It was as if the 4 women had been erased in the middle of their lives. In the refectory, the long dining table was set for breakfast for 4. Bowls, spoons, and mugs sat waiting, untouched. The officers logged the detail carefully. It suggested the women had been present that morning, or at least had prepared for the day ahead. By nightfall, the search had widened to the surrounding hills, but there was no trace of the missing nuns. As darkness fell over San Martino, the monastery's tall windows reflected nothing but the moonlight. The village, usually so sure of the monastery's constant presence, felt suddenly exposed, as if a wall had been taken away. No one could say for certain what had happened, but everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever had taken them, it had done so quietly, without breaking a single lock, without leaving a single cry for help behind. And that quiet was somehow worse than any sign of violence. The following morning, the police would begin digging deeper into the nuns' recent lives, unaware that the small details they overlooked that first day, the candle still burning, the locked doors, the flicker of light late at night, would become central to a mystery that would grip the village for decades. The day after the disappearance, the Carabinieri returned with more officers, this time determined to gather every possible detail from the people who had lived their whole lives in the shadow of the monastery walls. They began with the obvious questions. When was the last time anyone had seen the four nuns, and did anyone hear or see anything unusual in the nights leading up to November 18th? At first, answers were cautious. In a village as small as San Martino, where the church's presence was woven into every tradition and family, no one wanted to speak ill of the nuns or the institution they served. But as the hours passed and the shock of their disappearance began to sink in, stories that had been quietly kept within households started to surface. Several villagers, unconnected to one another, mentioned hearing noises in the weeks before the women vanished. They described them as slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the attic space late at night, long after the monastery was locked. One farmer, who tended land just beyond the monastery orchard, claimed he had heard the sound of chanting drifting out of the building during the small hours, but the melody and words didn't match any known hymns. He said it was softer, slower, and unsettling, almost like someone reciting something in a language he couldn't place. When asked why he hadn't reported it sooner, he simply shrugged and said, "You don't question the monastery. You keep your head down." The most striking account came from an elderly woman named Signora Belanti, who lived across the square from the chapel. She recalled seeing a man in a dark coat arrive late one afternoon just a few days before the nuns disappeared. She couldn't identify him. He wasn't a villager, but she remembered him standing outside the chapel doors with the Mother Superior, their conversation growing heated. At one point, she saw the Mother Superior glance around, as if checking whether anyone was watching. The man's gestures became sharper, more insistent, until finally she turned away and led him inside. Belanti hadn't seen him leave. When the detectives asked if she could describe him, she only remembered the way he walked, slow, deliberate, and leaning slightly to one side, as if favoring an old injury. The detectives began to wonder if this mystery visitor might be connected to the strange noises, but any hope of learning more from official church records was quickly complicated. When they requested access to the monastery's archives, they were met with polite but firm resistance from diocesan officials. It was only after hours of negotiation and the suggestion of obtaining a court order that they were allowed to review older parish documents. Among the neatly bound registers of baptisms, marriages, and deaths, they found a less organized collection, brittle papers and typewritten reports stored in an unmarked folder. These revealed a chapter of the monastery's history that no one in the village spoke about openly. In the 1950s, long before the four missing nuns had taken their vows, the building had served as an orphanage for children displaced by the war. At first glance, the records seemed routine: lists of names, dates of admission, and transfers to foster families or other institutions. But interspersed among them were quiet notations and discreetly worded letters hinting at incidents of disciplinary excess and inappropriate conduct involving some of the staff. Further investigation revealed that multiple allegations of abuse had been made against one particular lay caretaker, though no criminal charges were ever filed. Instead, the documents suggested that the matter had been handled internally by the church and that the man had been transferred to another facility. The absence of any official police involvement made it impossible to confirm details, but the implication was clear. The monastery had once been at the center of a scandal, one that had been carefully and deliberately buried. When word of this discovery began to leak through the village, the tone of the conversation shifted. People who had once described the nuns as pillars of the community began to speculate in hushed voices about whether they might have stumbled upon something similar in recent months. Some suggested that the unknown man seen with the Mother Superior might have been connected to that older history. Others wondered whether the strange noises in the attic were tied to hidden parts of the monastery no one had entered in decades. The detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that the nuns had uncovered a secret, one dangerous enough to put them in harm's way. Yet there were no signs they had tried to leave voluntarily, no missing personal effects, no word to relatives, no farewell letters. If they had been silenced, it had been done with precision and without leaving obvious traces. By the end of that second day, the investigators had more questions than answers. Who was the man seen arguing with the Mother Superior? Why had the chanting and footsteps begun only recently? And if the building had once been a place where dark things were hidden from the outside world, what else might still be buried within its walls? The officers began to suspect that the events of November 18th might not have been the beginning of the story at all, but the end of a much older one. When the initial search of the monastery resumed on the third day, the investigators turned their attention back to the chapel. It had been given only a cursory look on the first sweep, and now, with the unsettling accounts from the villagers still fresh in their minds, the detectives wanted a more meticulous examination. The chapel was a narrow, dim space of stone and wood, filled with the faint scent of old incense. It was here that one officer noticed something unusual along the right-hand wall. One of the confessionals appeared slightly different from the others. While the other booths stood open, their heavy curtains tied neatly to the side, this one was closed tight. A closer inspection revealed that the door was not merely stuck, it had been nailed shut. Several small iron nails, dulled with age, were driven through the wood at uneven intervals, their heads flush as though placed with deliberate care. The oddity drew the immediate attention of the team leader. The nails were positioned from the inside, which was strange enough, but what struck the officers more was the absence of any official record or sign that the confessional was out of use. One officer pried at the wood, but it resisted. After conferring briefly, they brought in a small crowbar and worked at the door until the nails gave way with sharp, dry cracks. When the door finally swung open, the interior was revealed. A cramped wooden compartment lined with dust so thick it seemed undisturbed for years. The single kneeler was slightly askew, and the small grill separating penitent from priest hung crooked in its frame. There was nobody inside, no immediate sign of struggle, but in the dim light, something on the floor caught their attention. A rosary. The cross snapped clean in two, the beads scattered like tiny black seeds across the boards. It looked as if it had been crushed under force. Forensics was called in to examine the space, and under the layer of dust on the wooden kneeler, they found faint, almost invisible smears of what appeared to be dried blood. The stain had seeped into the grain of the wood long ago, too faded and degraded to yield a usable DNA profile, but its presence was undeniable. The discovery changed the tone of the search. Until then, there had been no physical evidence hinting at harm. Now they had something, however small, that suggested violence had occurred within the monastery walls. Forensics continued their slow sweep, photographing every detail. Behind the kneeler, wedged against the wall, one technician spotted a scrap of paper. It was fragile, singed along the edges, and partially blackened as though it had been caught in a fire. The handwriting was hurried and uneven. Only one sentence remained legible. "We cannot let him in. He will take everything." The note was bagged and taken for analysis, though the handwriting was too distorted for immediate comparison. Still, its implications were chilling. Whoever wrote it had been desperate enough to hide it somewhere they thought no one would find it. The phrasing suggested not just fear, but fear of someone specific, a him who was already close enough to be a threat. Detectives gathered in the chapel that afternoon, reviewing what they knew so far. The locked doors, the candle burning into the night, the witness account of an argument with a strange man, the noises in the attic, and now a sealed confessional with blood traces and a note hinting at danger. Piece by piece, it was beginning to look less like a voluntary disappearance and more like a situation in which the nuns had been under siege, possibly from within. The fact that the confessional had been nailed shut from the inside was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Why would someone trap themselves in such a confined space? Or had it been sealed later, after something happened inside? One theory began to form among the investigative team. If the nuns had been aware of an intruder or someone already living within the monastery without their consent, they might have tried to secure certain areas or hide away evidence. The confessional could have been a hiding place, or perhaps somewhere a confrontation had occurred. The cracked rosary suggested a struggle, not necessarily fatal, but violent enough to break a sacred object. The bloodstains, faint as they were, hinted at injury. And the note, with its urgency and finality, suggested that time had been running out for whoever wrote it. By evening, the chapel was sealed off as a protected scene. Officers moved their search into the connected hallways, looking for any other signs of hidden compartments or blocked passageways. The monastery was an old structure, and it was easy to imagine someone slipping through its warren of rooms and staircases unnoticed. The small discovery inside the confessional had opened a new line of thinking for the detectives, the possibility that the 4 nuns had not simply been taken, but that they had anticipated what was coming. And if they had, then somewhere inside these walls there might be more messages like the one they found. The search was no longer just about finding the missing women. It was now about uncovering what they had been so determined to keep from him and why they believed losing it would mean losing everything. In the weeks following the discovery of the sealed confessional, the investigation into the missing nuns of San Martino began to lose its initial momentum. At first, the small rural police station was overwhelmed with tips, sightings, and self-proclaimed witnesses, the kind of flood that comes when a mystery captures public imagination. But as each lead was pursued and quietly collapsed under scrutiny, the sense of urgency that had once consumed the village began to thin. Winter deepened. Snow weighed down the monastery's roof, and still there was no sign of the 4 women who had once moved through its halls every day. The first significant lead came from a market town 50 miles to the south. A shopkeeper claimed to have seen 2 women in full habits browsing the shelves in his store just after Christmas. He remembered them because they spoke quietly in Italian, but their accents were not quite right, softer, rural, like the villagers from San Martino. Detectives traveled immediately, combing through security footage from nearby shops and bus stations. The grainy images they found did show 2 women in religious clothing, but closer examination revealed their habits were of a different order entirely, and they belonged to a convent hundreds of miles away. It was the first of many disappointments. Soon after, a truck driver came forward with a more dramatic account. He claimed he had been driving a late-night delivery route along the mountain road on the very night of the disappearance when he spotted a lone figure in a nun's habit walking along the shoulder. He said he stopped and offered her a ride, and she climbed into his cab without a word, staring out the window for the entire drive. When he asked where she was going, she supposedly said only, "Away from here." The story caught the attention of both investigators and the press. It was the first suggestion that at least one of the nuns might have left the village alive. But under questioning, the driver's account began to unravel. Dates shifted. Details contradicted his earlier statements. Eventually, he admitted he had fabricated the encounter after reading about the case, hoping the attention might bring him media interviews. The confession left detectives frustrated and wary of further false leads. With each dead end, the coverage faded. National newspapers that had once carried the nuns' faces on their front pages now relegated the story to brief mentions, if they mentioned it at all. Television crews stopped coming to San Martino, and the satellite vans that had once crowded the narrow streets disappeared. Without the pressure of constant public attention, the diocesan authorities grew quieter too, offering no new information and rarely commenting on the investigation. As the months turned into a year, the monastery itself began to change. Without the daily rhythm of the 4 nuns' lives, the building felt empty, its echoing corridors and cold chapels more like a relic than a living institution. The only constant presence was an aging priest, Father Antonio, who took on the basic duties of upkeep, tending the small garden, ensuring the chapel doors remained open for Mass, and keeping the candles lit. He moved through the building with a kind of careful resignation, avoiding certain rooms entirely, as though they were locked away in his own memory. For the villagers, the unanswered questions lingered like a shadow. How had the nuns left the monastery when every exit had been secured from the inside? If they had been taken, why had no one heard or seen anything? And why, in a place so small, where strangers stood out instantly, had no trace of them been found anywhere in the surrounding countryside? Some still clung to the idea that they had chosen to disappear, perhaps fleeing to another order under new identities. Others whispered darker theories, that they were hidden in some unsearched corner of the monastery or in the network of old tunnels said to run beneath it, sealed away from the world. By the second anniversary, the official investigation had been reduced to little more than periodic file reviews and the occasional follow-up on a new tip. The case was never formally closed, but it had slipped quietly into the category of cold cases, its active pursuit replaced by the grinding inertia of uncertainty. For San Martino, life resumed its routines, but the monastery no longer felt like a safe or sacred space. It was a place marked by absence, watched over by a single frail figure who seemed to grow older with each passing winter. In time, children grew up knowing the story, only as a kind of village cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the most familiar places, people could vanish without warning. Yet for those who had known the women personally, the loss was not something to be neatly folded into history. It was an open wound, kept alive by the smallest of details. The last hymn sung in the chapel, the bread left cooling on the kitchen counter, the candle that burnt far too late into the night. They didn't know it then, but the building they now regarded as abandoned still held something from that night, hidden deep within its structure, waiting more than 2 decades to be found. And when it finally was, it would shatter what little peace the village had built in their absence. By the spring of 2023, the monastery of San Martino had stood in quiet disrepair for more than 2 decades. The ivy had crept higher along its stone walls, the roof tiles sagged under years of neglect, and dust had settled thick over the pews in the chapel. What little life remained within it came from the slow steps of Father Antonio, whose frail hands struggled to keep the building from sinking further into decay. That changed with the arrival of Father Luca. At 38, he was younger than most priests the village had seen, sharp in his movements, with a way of looking at the world that suggested he preferred order over mystery. The diocese had assigned him to San Martino with a clear purpose, to breathe life back into the place, to restore its dignity and service. When he first walked through the gates, the villagers watched from their windows. Many still avoided speaking about the disappearance of the 4 nuns, but the monastery's empty windows were a reminder too constant to forget. A few approached him with warm greetings, curious about his plans, but most offered only warnings dressed as friendly advice. Some told him plainly of the curse, their voices lowering as they recounted the night the nuns had vanished without a sound. Others advised him not to disturb certain parts of the building, as though touching them would invite trouble. Father Luca smiled politely, thanked them, and carried on. In his mind, the past was the past. The monastery needed more than whispered fears to bring it back to life. He began with repairs. The cracked flagstones in the courtyard were lifted and reset. The roof was patched to stop the leaks that had stained the chapel's ceiling. He worked alongside a small crew during the day and alone in the evenings, often lingering in the chapel long after the village lights had gone dark. To him, the building's silence was not ominous, but peaceful, a space waiting to be filled with prayer again. Yet the villagers noted how often the young priest kept to himself, eating most of his meals in the rectory and rarely lingering in the square. One evening in late October, a storm rolled down from the mountains, bringing heavy rain and wind that rattled the stained glass windows. The workers had gone home early, leaving Father Luca in the chapel with only a lamp for light. He had been meaning to address a section of warped floorboards near the altar, a spot that had been uneven for as long as anyone could remember. Kneeling down, he worked the edge of the crowbar into the gap between 2 planks. The wood was stubborn, as though it had been sealed against disturbance. When the first board finally gave way, his hammer struck something that did not sound like stone or wood, but a dull, metallic thud. He paused, brushing away the splinters and peering into the dark cavity beneath. The beam from his lamp caught on a small corner of rusted metal buried under layers of dust and debris. Its edges were too deliberate, too precise to be a piece of construction scrap. Setting his tools aside, he cleared more of the cavity until the full outline came into view. A box, perhaps 12 inches across, its surface corroded but unmistakably forged to last. The box was wedged tightly, as if whoever placed it there had ensured it would not shift over time. It was not the sort of thing one might drop or lose by accident. Father Luca's hand hovered over it for a moment, his mind caught between curiosity and the uneasy awareness that he had uncovered something deliberately hidden. The storm outside rattled the chapel doors, and a distant roll of thunder masked the faint scrape of the box as he worked it free. When it finally came loose, he set it on the altar steps, the metal cold against his palms. It had no visible lock, only a seam where the lid met the body, sealed with a thick layer of wax and dust. The placement struck him directly beneath the altar's edge, in the very heart of the chapel, in a spot where decades of priests had stood to give Mass. Whoever put it there had chosen a place both sacred and central, yet hidden in plain sight. He sat back, staring at it, the shadows in the chapel deepening as the lamp flickered. The warnings from the villagers drifted back into his mind, not as superstition now, but as something more pointed, more cautionary. He did not yet know what was inside, but the weight of the box in his hands told him it was not meant for casual discovery. Somewhere in the dark of the storm, the bells of San Martino swayed, but did not ring, their silence pressing down on the empty nave. Father Luca leaned closer, brushing away the last of the dust from the lid, and realized that what he had found was not simply forgotten. It had been buried for a reason that, once uncovered, would bind him to the monastery's darkest night in ways he could not yet imagine. The box was heavier than its size suggested, the weight oddly uneven inside, as if whatever it held had shifted over time. Father Luca carried it to the small sacristy table, brushing away decades of dust from its rusted surface. There was no lock, only the stubborn seal of wax and corrosion along its seam. He worked the edge of a chisel into the gap and pressed until the metal groaned and gave way, the lid lifting with a faint rasp that seemed far too loud in the quiet of the chapel. Inside, nestled in the dry, splintered bottom, lay 4 rosaries. Each was carefully coiled, the beads dull with age, but the silver crucifixes still held a faint shine. Attached to each cross was a tiny silver tag, and on each tag, a name: Agnes, Claire, Beatrice, or Maria. The air around him seemed to shift, the temperature cooler, as if the presence of these objects had been sealed away, not just from sight, but from memory. He lifted one carefully, letting the beads pool into his palm. They were cold to the touch, colder than the air in the room, and the engraved nameplate swung slightly, catching the lamplight. Beneath the rosaries lay a tightly bound roll of parchment thick as a man's wrist, secured with a length of twine so brittle it snapped at the slightest pull. The parchment was stained in patches, the marks dark and irregular, as though something had seeped into the fibers long ago. When he unrolled the first few inches, the musty scent of aged paper and candle smoke drifted up, along with the faintest trace of something metallic, the kind of smell that clung to old blood. The handwriting shifted from page to page, 4 distinct styles interwoven, as if each woman had taken turns adding her thoughts. The early entries were calm, routine notations of daily life, prayers recited, meals prepared, letters received from the diocese. But as the days progressed, the tone began to change. The words grew shorter and more clipped, and the spacing between lines became erratic, as though written in haste. A note from Sister Beatrice mentioned hearing footsteps outside her cell after midnight, the kind that stopped abruptly when she sat up in bed. Sister Claire wrote of finding the chapel door unlatched one morning, though she had bolted it herself the night before. The entries soon abandoned the daily details altogether, focusing instead on something they referred to only as him. They described a man who comes only after compline, the final prayers of the night. They never used his name, never gave a clear description, but their words suggested they all knew who he was. Sister Agnes noted that his presence was first sensed in the upper corridors, then later in the chapel itself. Sister Maria, the youngest, wrote that she had awoken to find a shadow standing just beyond the curtain of her cell, motionless until she called out. She claimed that when she looked again, it was gone. The fear in their writing deepened over the days. There were hints that they had searched the building together, checking the locked storerooms, the attic, and even the unused catacombs beneath the monastery. They spoke of finding things out of place, a loaf of bread taken from the kitchen, a candle missing from the sacristy, and a chair dragged away from the table as though someone had been sitting there in the dark. The most unsettling detail was an entry in Sister Clare's hand. He knows we are speaking of him. He waits for the right night. As Father Luca turned the brittle pages, the lamplight caught words written in heavier, darker ink, the pen pressing hard enough to score the parchment. The handwriting was more erratic now, almost frantic. They mentioned blocking certain doors at night, keeping their rosaries on them at all times, and meeting together in the chapel to pray until they were too exhausted to stand. Sister Agnes wrote of a final choice they would soon have to make, but gave no further detail. Then, midway through a page written in Sister Maria's small, neat hand, the ink stopped abruptly. The sentence read, "We hear him on the stairs again, if we," and then nothing. No trailing mark, no smear, as though the pen had been lifted suddenly and never returned. The remaining pages were blank. Father Lucas sat back, the parchment spread before him, the 4 rosaries lined up like silent witnesses to whatever had taken place that night. The storm outside had begun to break, the rain easing to a steady patter, but the stillness in the chapel felt heavier now, more watchful. The words on the page were not just the recollections of frightened women, they were a record of a siege, one that had closed in over days until it consumed them entirely. Somewhere beyond the stained glass and the cracked stone walls, the village slept, unaware that the truth of that winter in 2001 had been resting beneath their altar for more than 20 years. And as Father Luca read the final half-sentence again, he could not shake the sense that the last sound those women ever heard was not a prayer, but the slow, deliberate creak of someone ascending the chapel stairs. When the iron box and its contents were handed over to the authorities, the reaction in the local police station was immediate and electric. For more than 2 decades, the case of the 4 vanished nuns had existed only in the brittle yellowing pages of an unsolved file. Now there was something tangible, names etched into silver, personal effects, and most importantly, a written record in the nuns' own hands. The diary pages were transferred to a climate-controlled evidence room, and within a week, handwriting analysts confirmed what many had already suspected. The entries matched verified samples from the missing women, collected from parish archives and personal correspondence. Each woman's style was distinct, and the sequence of entries made it clear they had written in rotation, passing the parchment among themselves in the final weeks of their lives. The passages selected for review by the investigative team were deeply unsettling. Over and over, the women referred to him, always in lowercase, never by name. They wrote not as though he were an outsider forcing his way in, but as though he already belonged to the building in some unnatural way. Sister Agnes described hearing muffled footsteps on the floor below her room, though no one had lived in the lower levels for decades. Sister Clare wrote of prayers interrupted by the sound of something moving behind the sacristy wall. Sister Beatrice mentioned a strange smell of damp and smoke that would drift through the chapel after midnight, dissipating by morning. One entry from Sister Maria was the most disturbing. In her careful script she wrote, "We know now where he hides. The food we keep for winter has been vanishing, always in small amounts, never enough to be noticed quickly. The whispers in the corridors are not our imagination. We found the old door unbolted, the one the Mother Superior swore would never be opened again. It has been locked for decades. He is beneath us, watching, waiting." The mention of the old door caught the detective's attention. Records from the monastery's maintenance logs confirmed that a heavy oak door leading to the lower catacombs had indeed been sealed in the 1970s, supposedly for structural safety after part of the tunnels collapsed. There had been no record of it being opened since. That it was now described as unbolted suggested someone had been accessing those spaces. Later entries hinted at something far more complex than a prowler or trespasser. Sister Maria's final note, the last words committed to the parchment, read, "The pact was made before we came here. It was not ours to keep." She feared what would be revealed. The "she" could only refer to the Mother Superior, who had died in the mid-1990s, years before the disappearance. The phrasing, "unholy pact," in the margin, penned in Sister Agnes's sharper, heavier hand, suggested a deliberate choice to record it, but not explain it in writing. Faced with the diary's content, investigators had no choice but to return to the monastery. With Father Luca's reluctant permission, they brought in ground-penetrating radar and structural engineers to assess the lower levels. The radar confirmed large hollow spaces beneath the chapel and eastern wing, some of which did not correspond to any known floor plans. Within days, a team descended into the catacombs for the first time in more than 40 years. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of mold, and the walls were lined with centuries-old crypts. But in one side chamber, the search team found something unexpected, not bones, but signs of habitation. Against the far wall stood an old military cot, the thin mattress rotted through in places. Nearby lay the rusted frame of a lantern, its glass long since shattered, and a small stack of tin food containers, their labels faded and curled. The dust on the floor was disturbed in irregular patterns, suggesting movement had occurred there long after the area was supposedly sealed. Closer examination revealed that the room had once been connected to other parts of the catacombs, but the connecting tunnel had been bricked over, the mortar newer than the surrounding stone. In the corner, the investigators found scraps of cloth, coarse fabric, darkened with grime, that, when tested, proved to be consistent with civilian clothing from the late 20th century. No complete garment remained, but one piece bore a button unlike anything from the monastery's stores. The find was damning. Someone had been living beneath the monastery for an unknown period of time. Whether he was a vagrant who found his way in, a figure from the monastery's hidden past, or someone deliberately kept there, the diary entries left no doubt that the nuns knew about him and feared him. The discovery reopened questions that had been buried along with the case file. If the catacombs had been sealed for safety, who had the authority to reopen them? And why had the nuns' fear escalated to the point of recording it in writing, knowing the risk of such a confession being found? That night, as the search team packed up their equipment, one detective lingered by the old oak door, running his hand over the heavy grain of the wood. The bolt was new, installed after the disappearance, but the marks around the latch showed it had once been forced open from the inside. Whatever had been waiting beneath the monastery in 2001 had not been an accident of architecture or chance. And with each step deeper into the case, it was becoming harder to avoid the conclusion that the nuns' final nights had been shaped by something or someone the church had long known about and chosen not to confront. The discovery in the catacombs forced investigators to widen their scope far beyond the immediate events of 2001. If someone had been living under the monastery in the months before the nuns disappeared, they needed to know who he was and how he had come to be there. The search led them into dusty municipal archives, parish records, and the private correspondence of former diocesan officials, documents that, until now, no one had considered relevant to the case. It was in the basement of the diocesan library, inside a folder marked simply "Personnel Restricted," that a name emerged. In 1972, a 17-year-old named Matteo Ricci, the son of a prominent businessman and longtime patron of the church, had been sent to San Martino for spiritual correction. The euphemistic phrase appeared in multiple letters, but its meaning became clearer with further reading. Matteo had been expelled from 2 Catholic boarding schools for violent behavior, and had been accused, though never formally charged, in an incident involving a female staff member at one of them. The official record in the parish registry stated that Matteo had stayed at the monastery for less than a year before running away one winter night. A brief note in the local newspaper from that time confirmed the disappearance and described a small search effort, but nothing more. There were no police files, no witness statements. It seemed to have been treated as a private family matter, but buried among the correspondence were several confidential letters exchanged between the Mother Superior at the time and the diocesan chancellor. These were different in tone, tense, urgent, and stripped of polite formality. One, dated weeks after Matteo's supposed disappearance, contained a line that stood out to modern eyes. The arrangement is in place. No further risk to the sisters if he remains below. The implication was grim. It suggested that Matteo had never left San Martino at all. The arrangement appeared to involve moving him into the sealed lower levels of the monastery, the same catacombs that had officially been declared unsafe years later. Another letter referred obliquely to his tendencies and warned that he must never be left unguarded. It also noted that his family had agreed to continue financial support for the upkeep of the monastery, phrased in a way that sounded less like charity and more like payment for silence. Piecing together the scattered evidence, investigators began to see a darker version of events. If Matteo had been hidden away in the catacombs to avoid scandal, the decision would have required absolute secrecy from everyone involved, secrecy that could only be maintained by limiting who knew he was there. Over time, as priests and nuns were reassigned, it was possible that only a small handful of people, perhaps only the Mother Superior and a trusted few, were aware of his existence. The diary recovered from beneath the altar fit too neatly into this possibility to ignore. The nuns' references to him as already inside the monastery, the missing food, the noises after midnight, and the door that had been bolted for decades suddenly had a name: Matteo Ricci. The entries suggested the women had pieced together the truth slowly, perhaps by stumbling upon the unsealed door or finding items that could not be explained any other way. The tone of their later writings hinted at more than fear. There was a sense of betrayal, as though they had realized the danger was not a recent intrusion, but something the institution itself had allowed to exist for decades. Investigators could not determine exactly when or how Matteo might have escaped his underground confinement. But the absence of any mention of him in diocesan records after the late 1980s, combined with the diary entries from 2001, suggested that by the time the nuns encountered him, he was no longer under anyone's control. If the Mother Superior had been protecting the secret during her lifetime, her death in the mid-1990s may have left him unmonitored, free to roam the monastery at night while the rest of the world believed he was long dead. This revelation reframed the entire case. The disappearance of the 4 nuns was no longer an isolated mystery. It was the violent endpoint of a cover-up that had begun almost 30 years earlier. And the most unsettling question remained unanswered. If Matteo had indeed been living under the monastery all those years, what happened on that November night in 2001 to finally bring him into direct contact with the women upstairs? The answer would not be found in records or letters. It would lie in the bricked-off chambers of the catacombs themselves, in whatever evidence had been left behind after decades in the dark. And when the forensic team returned to those chambers with permission to dismantle the sealed wall, what they would uncover would erase the last traces of doubt about what the nuns had truly faced in their final hours. By the time investigators had gathered the diary entries, the archival letters, and the evidence from the catacombs, a grim picture of that November night in 2001 had begun to emerge. It was not a complete record. There were no witnesses outside the walls, no confession to fill in the silences, but the fragments aligned with an unsettling consistency. The nuns' final writings spoke of a growing certainty that he was moving more freely through the monastery, unrestrained and emboldened. They had decided, it seemed, to act. In the last days before they vanished, their notes hinted at plans to contact higher church authorities to force the matter into the open. That decision, if carried out, would have ended decades of secrecy. The reconstructed timeline suggested that the confrontation began late on the night of November 18th, long after Compline prayers had finished. For reasons no one could confirm, the women gathered in the chapel, perhaps to keep watch, perhaps because they knew he would come there. What happened next could only be pieced together from the physical evidence and the implications of the diary. The struggle was swift and violent. Marks found decades later on the chapel floor, faint but measurable under forensic light, suggested overturned furniture and heavy impacts. The broken rosary recovered from the sealed confessional may have been dropped or torn away in those moments. The theory investigators settled on was that Matteo Ricci, no longer the boy hidden away but a man hardened by decades in isolation, had been confronted by all four nuns at once. But he was not alone. Somewhere in those minutes, the elderly priest who had served under the former Mother Superior intervened. His role was not one of protection for the women, but for the secret that had been kept for so long. Whether out of loyalty to the church, fear of scandal, or something more personal, he sided with the man the nuns feared. Together, they overpowered the women. From there, the evidence led downward. The open bolt on the catacomb door, the disturbed dust in the tunnels, and the sealed chamber all pointed to the same conclusion. The nuns were taken below. In the bricked-off section of the catacombs, investigators found the most conclusive proof the case would ever produce. Behind the wall, in a narrow, low-ceilinged space, lay four sets of skeletal remains. They were positioned in a way that suggested they had been placed deliberately, side by side, their arms drawn across their midsections. Each still wore the remnants of a habit, cloth so degraded it disintegrated under touch, but the shapes were unmistakable. The bones of their hands were bound together with rosary chains, the crucifixes still hanging against their ribs. Forensic analysis confirmed what the village had feared for 22 years. The bones belonged to Sisters Agnes, Claire, Beatrice, and Maria. The cause of death could not be established with certainty. The damage of time had stripped away that evidence. But there were signs of blunt force trauma on several of the skulls and ribs, consistent with violent assault. The bindings told their own story. Whatever else had happened, they'd been restrained in their final moments, denied even the small dignity of free movement before the end. The location of the burial left little doubt that it had been planned, not improvised. The chamber had once been part of a larger passage, now sealed with newer brickwork that matched repairs elsewhere in the monastery from the early 2000s. The mortar dated to within weeks of their disappearance. Whoever placed them there had done so, knowing exactly which parts of the catacombs would remain untouched. The find silenced the lingering voices in the village who had held out hope that the nuns had fled voluntarily. It also hardened suspicion toward the one living figure who had been there in 2001 and who still remained in San Martino, the old priest, now confined to a care home. Though no formal charges were filed immediately, the weight of the discovery pressed toward an inevitable confrontation. The evidence could not prove every step of the night's events, but it made clear the outcome. The women had confronted something they could no longer live with, and in doing so, had triggered the final act of a secret that had been festering under the monastery for decades. When the remains were brought up from the catacombs, each was placed in a separate coffin, draped in white cloth. Villagers lined the square, some crossing themselves, others simply staring as the procession passed. For many, the image of the four coffins was the first tangible reality of what had once been an abstract, whispered tragedy. The return of their bodies was not a comfort, but it was an answer, and an unshakable reminder that what happened beneath the monastery had been born of human choices, not the curse that superstition had claimed. But the final reckoning was still to come. The bones were silent, the diary incomplete, and the man they had feared was long dead. That left only one person alive who could explain why the four women had been bound, taken below, and buried in darkness, and why for 22 years, he had never spoken a word. When the remains were officially identified, the last thread of doubt in San Martino was gone. For 22 years, the village had lived in the shadow of a mystery that many feared would never be solved. Now there were names for the bones and a place to put the grief. But there was still one question hanging over everyone. Why had it happened, and who had carried the knowledge all this time without speaking? The answer lay in a quiet care home on the outskirts of the province, where the last living witness to that night was waiting. The old priest was frail, his body reduced to a thin frame that seemed swallowed by the chair he sat in. Age had dulled his voice, but his eyes still carried the weight of someone who had spent decades guarding something too heavy to speak aloud. Detectives did not need to tell him why they were there. The moment they placed photographs of the catacomb chamber on the table, his shoulders sank. He stared at them for a long time before speaking, as though deciding whether the truth could finally be allowed into the open. He began haltingly, his words shaped by a strange mix of regret and justification. He referred to Matteo Ricci not by name, but as the lost lamb, a soul entrusted to his care after the Mother Superior's death. He said Matteo had been troubled from the start, unpredictable and volatile, but he believed it was his duty to keep the young man hidden, both for Matteo's safety and to protect the church from scandal. By the time the nuns discovered his existence, the old priest claimed, Matteo had grown paranoid, convinced they meant to have him removed. When they gathered that night in the chapel, he said, it was to confront him, and Matteo saw it as betrayal. According to the priest, the confrontation escalated quickly. He described a rage overtaking the lost lamb, a sudden violence that left no room for reason. The women, bound together by their plan to go to higher authorities, refused to be silenced. In his account, the priest did not join the attack, but neither did he stop it. By the time it was over, all 4 women were dead. His voice faltered when he spoke of their final moments, but whether from remorse or the strain of speaking after so many years, it was impossible to tell. 2 days later, Matteo fell gravely ill. The priest believed it was some infection he had carried for weeks, worsened by the damp of the catacombs. With no doctor to call and no intention of alerting anyone outside the monastery, he stayed with him until he died. That death, he said, was when he made the decision that would seal the fate of the case for decades. He buried Matteo in the crypt beneath the monastery, a place so rarely visited that no one would stumble across the grave. Then, under the cover of night, he moved the nuns' bodies into the bricked-off chamber in the catacombs, arranging them side by side, binding their hands with their own rosaries. He said it was to keep them together, but the gesture felt as much like containment as reverence. When asked why he had done it, why he had not told the truth when the investigation first began, his answer was simple and chilling. The church must be spared, he said. The weight of scandal in his mind outweighed the truth. To protect the institution, he had been willing to let the village believe in a mystery, to let families hold on to false hope, and to live with the knowledge of where the women lay all those years. Father Luca received the full statement later that week. Bound by the diocesan hierarchy, he was instructed to place the confession in sealed church records, not to be released publicly. But he refused to let the nuns' story end in secrecy. He insisted on a proper burial, a service that would name them aloud, bless their graves, and return them to the earth with the dignity they had been denied. On the morning of the funeral, the entire village gathered. 4 coffins, simple and unadorned, were carried through the square to the small cemetery beside the chapel. As the priest read the final rites, the bells of San Martino began to toll, their sound breaking the silence that had hung over the monastery for 22 years. The chimes rolled out across the valley, touching every home, every field, every ear that had once heard only quiet in their place. For those who had lived through it, the ringing was both an ending and a reckoning. The truth of the monastery's silence had been laid bare, not the work of curses or mysteries beyond comprehension, but of choices made by men who valued secrecy above justice. And while the bells marked the close of the case, their echoes carried the memory of 4 women whose final act had been to stand together, even when they knew it might cost them everything.